Shalom, I'm Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, and I welcome you to this edition of Revealing Prophecy. Each week we connect the dots of the news from around the globe with biblical prophecy and talk about what was, what is, and what is to come. The monologue is our original work, and all other articles are used giving credit to their respective sources. We invite you to visit ignitinganation.com for a full roster of daily interviews, and we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never have to miss out on any special offers or events. Here's a quick look at what we'll be covering on today's show. I'll be opening with a monologue, which is my testimony this time, that's been included in a best-selling book. Our first story is entry of radical Islamic forces into northern Syria is disturbing, coming from an ex-Israeli intelligence official. The next story, concern in Gulf Arab states after the U.S. pulled out from Syria. Our next story, Netanyahu tells the president he can't form a government. Now it's Benny Gantz's turn to try. And our final story, nearing midnight, thinking on Gog, Magog, contributed by Terry James. As we look at Scripture, we see that there are approximately 2,500 prophecies contained in the Bible. Almost 1/3 of the Bible is dedicated to prophecy, of which approximately 2,000 prophecies have been fulfilled. Given that the Bible proves so reliable a document, there's every reason to expect that the remaining 500 prophecies, those slated for the time of the end, also will be fulfilled to the last letter. Who can afford to ignore these coming events, much less miss out on the immeasurable blessings offered to anyone and everyone who submits to the control of the Bible's author, God Himself? Would a reasonable person take lightly God's warning of judgment for those who reject what they know to be true about Jesus and the Bible, or who reject Jesus' claim on their lives? Over the course of the past few years, I have been asked on more than one occasion to share my testimony. My good friend Carl Gallups asked me to tell my story for inclusion in his best-selling book, The Rabbi, The Secret Message, and the Messiah. I highly recommend the book as it reveals the secret message declaring Yeshua, Jesus, as the Messiah by Rabbi Yitzhak Kadori, one of Israel's most famous rabbis. Here is my story as written and included in the book. I grew up in the Jewish community in Pittsburgh, born in 1952, to a father whose family immigrated from Hungary and a mother whose family immigrated from Galicia, which was southern Poland, western Ukraine. My father's family changed their name from Vovovich to Walker in 1934 to avoid religious persecution at the insistence of my Hungarian grandfather, Bernat, who spoke 7 languages and was the maitre d' at the German-American Club in New York City during World War II. From my earliest memories, my greatest influence into my Jewish identity was fostered by my grandparents, who lived 20 miles from us, but we spent every Shabbat at their home, and I would walk to the conservative synagogue with my maternal grandfather, Robert Amper. Being Jewish was a way of life. We lived in the Jewish community, our friends were Jewish, and our family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and my own brothers and sisters belonged to the Jewish Country Club. At that time, we belonged to a Reform synagogue, but they did not perform bar mitzvahs, so I began to attend my grandparents' synagogue in preparation for this important rite of passage. My grandfather loved Israel and told us of his service in the United States Navy in World War I and his desire to enlist to fight those who persecuted us in the shtetls of Eastern Europe. He was a Zionist, but he did not want to move to Israel or even encourage any of us to do so. His position was clearly that if all American Jews moved to Israel, who would be left to raise money in support of the new Jewish state? His contribution to Israel was commemorated when he was named Israel Bond's Man of the Year in 1959. This great honor brought him personal introduction to Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, and Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, Abba Eban. My grandmother, Lillian Amper, was the president of Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America. Together they labored side by side to lead fundraising drives in support of Israel and the return of Soviet Jews to Israel. As a child, I remember many conversations about one cousin of my grandfather who was the only survivor in her family in the Holocaust. She was a seamstress who worked in a labor camp where she was assigned to sew and repair German officers' uniforms. The family raised money to bring her to America from the last of the displaced person camps in Europe. She was very small, and her feet, because they were beaten, were quite deformed. Growing up in a house where my paternal grandparents had thick accents and Yiddish was often spoken by all of my grandparents' siblings, their thick accent was no different than that of any of my other relatives and my friends' families. Growing up Jewish was nothing different than the world I lived in. Although I was not a great student, I did have an affinity for my religious studies, which culminated in my bar mitzvah in 1965, and after 2 more years of religious study, I was also confirmed. My great-grandfather was a rabbi, but this pursuit was never discussed in any of our families. I maintained my Jewish identity all through college, but not much different than my youth. My college friends were many from high school who grew up in the same Jewish community that I did. There were varying degrees of observance, but we still attended synagogue with our families during the high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. After graduation, I moved to New York City and remained there until I ultimately wound up in Atlanta in 1975. There I encountered my first real taste of anti-Semitism, as I was able to play golf at a certain country club, but was informed that I was not able to become a member as Jews were not allowed to join. I had joined an Orthodox synagogue and took a deep dive into my Jewish identity. It was there that I was deeply exposed to the Talmudic teachings or rabbinic traditions of Judaism. At no point in time had anyone ever shared the gospel or even attempted to open a dialogue. Again, I was surrounded by Jews and lived within the confines of the Jewish community. It wasn't until I was 40 that I began to question many things. During the period from 1975 to 1996, I lived in Atlanta, except for a 7-year period in Los Angeles. That took me completely out of my Jewish world, and my identity was blurred by the lifestyle of Southern California. When I returned to Atlanta in 1990, I no longer felt the connection to my Jewish identity, with the exception of one of my high school and college friends who was raised Orthodox, and together he and I would celebrate Passover and the High Holy Days. I tried to return to the synagogue, but the more I tried, the more I realized I knew nothing about God. I knew liturgy. I knew the teachings of the Talmud, but I knew nothing of God. At age 40, I began a new life and launched a personal spiritual journey, looking for meaning. I searched New Age teachings and began to think God was me, and in that new enlightenment began to associate with others who believed the same. It wasn't long before that theology crumbled, as I saw no difference between these teachings of men and the teachings of men I grew up under. It was not until 1994 that I had my first encounter with evangelical Christians. The dialogue was always the same: you need to come to church with us, and my response was automatically, no thanks, I'm Jewish. Then came the apology, as they did not want to offend me. They wanted to convey that they loved me, but when they said, I'm sorry, I would retort, what, sorry that I'm Jewish? And that would end the discussion. Over time, they persisted and tried one approach after another. Come to a passion play, come to our trunk or treat, come to our special musical, come to the church. And every time the response was the same: no thanks, I'm Jewish. And the same response from them: I'm sorry. This went on for almost 2 years until the fall of 1996. One Gentile friend in particular came to me and said, I found a place for you to go, and it's really Jewish. To be quite candid, that flipped a switch in me, and I blasted them, saying, what do you know about being Jewish? What do you know about being part of the most persecuted people in the entire world for the last 5,000 years? What do you know about the Holocaust and how many Jews have died at the hands of Christians? I was livid. But they were intentional in their approach and told me the place they wanted me to go was not a church. It was a synagogue, and they had a rabbi. Something softened in me when I heard those words, but I still resisted. Unbeknownst to them, I began calling in. The most loving, caring Gentile woman was the secretary and loved talking to me and answering every question I had. Finally, I relented, and these friends said they would take me on a Friday night and we would set the date. I began to ponder the whole scenario and began to ask myself, why do I need a Gentile to take me to a place to show me it was really Jewish? I woke up on a Saturday morning in December and decided I would just go by myself. I entered the Messianic Synagogue at 10:45 as I knew the service began at 11 a.m. I was immediately greeted by a man who, by my standards, was clearly Jewish. We spoke briefly and immediately brought the rabbi to meet me. The lobby was small and I could see into the congregation and noticed a very familiar setting. There were many in attendance wearing the traditional prayer shawl, the tallit and skull cap, the kippah, and I could clearly see the pulpit and the ark behind it. Everything seemed kosher to me. The rabbi greeted me and ushered me into his office, where we proceeded to talk about my Jewish upbringing, my Torah and Talmudic studies, and I glanced at the clock and saw that it was well past 11 o'clock when the service was scheduled to start. I mentioned this and he replied, "They can start without me. It's more important that I speak with you right now." Our conversation ended and he escorted me into the sanctuary, and instead of walking around the outside aisle, he paraded me down the middle and parked me on the second seat of the second pew. I had a sense of comfort as I was on familiar ground. Everything seemed in order and the liturgy was exactly what I experienced all my life. There was Davidic praise and worship, and they spoke and sang of this Yeshua, but I didn't know who they were really talking about. The Torah was read from, and the leader gave a short commentary on the text. Again, business as usual. People were happy, and I liked the feeling. The rabbi stood to preach, and that was when my Velvet Elvis experience began. It seemed that no matter where the rabbi walked back and forth across the stage, his eyes were looking straight at me. He began to describe the Lamb on Mount Moriah who brought about the redemption of Isaac. Then the Lamb who brought our redemption from captivity in Egypt, and straight into the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Now he had my attention. The two words that pierced my heart, take away. I knew there was only one day a year that our sin was taken away, and there was no temple for the priest to receive the two goats on the Day of Atonement. Who was this Lamb, and how could he take away sin? I was riveted and held on to every word as he spelled out God's plan of salvation. I had now heard the gospel in Jewish terms that made sense to me, and when asked if I wanted my sins taken away, I answered with a resounding yes. From that December 21st, 1996, I devoted myself to the in-depth study of the Bible. I took every class I could, both within the congregation and as many postgraduate courses as were available to me through the Messianic Yeshiva. I had incredible teachers such as Dr. Michael Brown, Dr. Michael Radelnick, Dr. Mitch Glazer, Dr. Jack Hayford, and so many more. The more I studied, the more on fire I became, and it wasn't long before I realized the heart of the Jewish Bible. Isaiah 53 had been omitted my entire traditional Jewish life. It was there in the Bible I used as a young man in synagogue. It was certainly never read in or as a part of the Haftorah readings of the prophets under any of the rabbinical systems. As I look back on this reality, I saw a picture of myself as a little boy in elementary school, learning how to make a Valentine's heart. You'd take a piece of red paper and fold it in half and cut a curve in the fold. Out would pop a heart-shaped cutout. When you opened up the sheet of red paper, you also saw where the heart had been cut out. This is exactly what had been done to my people for thousands of years. Now, 23 years later, I see two different aspects of the prophecies of Isaiah in complete context of the life and times of Isaiah. I see the prophetic content of Isaiah 53 and now an even more profound question and answer in reference to this most important chapter. Almost everyone, Jew or Gentile, who reads this chapter comes away with a vision of Yeshua, Jesus on the cross. I also see this as the divine prayer that brings about the salvation of Israel. When reading the words of God through the prophet Isaiah in a prophetic tone, it paints an unmistakable picture of the rejected, despised, and beaten Messiah. When in a prayerful tone, it contains all the elements needed to bring about salvation. In God's own words through this prophet, I believe he has given us the very words that will usher in Messiah's return. Imagine the setting of the advancing armies of the Antichrist, surrounding the new Sanhedrin, finding refuge in a place called Basra, which means sheep's gate, also a place known as Petra. Vastly outnumbered, they gather together looking upon imminent destruction. In the most dire of circumstances, they fall to their knees seeking divine intervention, and they cry out to God. They offer their confession of their rejection of the Messiah. Isaiah 53:1, "Who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not." Then they proclaim their newfound understanding of whom Yeshua, Jesus, really was. In Isaiah 53, beginning in verse 4, when they declare, "Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrow, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hands. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. He shall bear my iniquities. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he has poured out his soul unto death. And he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. And finally, the words that Yeshua, Jesus himself, proclaimed had to be said from Matthew 23:37 to 39, are offered up declaring, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The rest, as they say, is history as Jesus returns, as he is described in Isaiah 63:1. Who is it that comes from Edom with dyed garments from Basra? This that is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Wherefore art thou red in thine apparel, and thy garments like him that treadeth in the wine fat? I have trodden the winepress alone, and of the people there were none with me. For I will tread them in my anger, and trample them in my fury. And their blood shall be sprinkled upon my garments, and I will stain all my raiment. For the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed is come. And I looked, and there was none to help. And I wondered that there was none to uphold. Therefore my own arm brought salvation unto me, and my fury upheld me. And I will tread down the people in my anger and make them drunk in my fury, and I will bring down their strength to the earth. I will mention the loving kindness of the Lord and the praises of the Lord, according to all that the Lord hath bestowed on us, and the great goodness toward the house of Israel, which he hath bestowed on them according to his mercies and according to the multitude of his loving kindness. For he said, surely they are my people, children that they will not lie. So he was their Savior. This is my story, steeped in tradition and in prophecy, declaring to the four corners of the earth that Yeshua Jesus was and is the promised Jewish Messiah. It was just 23 years ago that I said yes to Yeshua. In that time, God has moved mountains and my life has radically changed. That is the impact of the transformation that takes place when this Jew was born anew. And now for the rest of today's Revealing Prophecy. Our first story. Entry of radical Islamic forces into northern Syria is disturbing, an ex-Israeli official says. Dated October 15, 2019, from JNS. Israel has been closely monitoring Turkey's brutal offensive against the Kurds in northeast Syria in recent days. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu condemned the Turkish invasion on October 10th, stating that Israel warns against the ethnic cleansing of the Kurds by Turkey and its proxies, and that Israel is prepared to extend humanitarian assistance to the gallant Kurdish people. However, Israel's concerns with regard to the Turkish operation extend beyond Ankara's conflict with the Kurds. IDF Forces Brigadier General Reserve Yossi Cooperwasser, former head of the IDF Military Intelligence Directorate's Research Division and Director General of Israel's Strategic Affairs Ministry, told JNS that the strengthening of Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated extremist Sunni forces in northeast Syria should disturb us. He stressed that Turkey had launched its offensive with problematic radical forces who are exploiting the U.S.'s wish to leave this area. In addition, said Cooperwasser, who is the director of the project on regional Middle East development at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, Iran could exploit the situation with its own Shiite militias. Iran could fill in the vacuum left by the United States in northeast Syria, which would enable them to establish a land corridor from Iran to Lebanon, he told JNS. It could project onto Israel, though not immediately. Speaking before the Kurdish-led Syrian Defense Forces signed a cooperation agreement with the Assad regime on Sunday night in response to the Turkish assault, Cooperwasser said that if the Kurds feel distressed and American pressure can't stop the Turks, they will try to link up with Assad as well as with the Russians and the Iranians with a request to cooperate with them. Islamic State, too, will likely benefit from events in Syria, said Cooperwasser, since all the others are busy with one another. ISIS has been hit hard, he said, but it's not defeated, and if pressure on it is relieved, it could come back. Retired four-star U.S. General Joseph Votel, former commander of U.S. Central Command, issued a stark warning in an op-ed for The Atlantic last week about the dangers of an ISIS resurgence. Trump's decision to pull special forces out of northern Syria, wrote Votel, threatens to undo 5 years' worth of fighting against ISIS and will severely damage American credibility and reliability. The decision, he wrote, was made without consulting U.S. allies or senior U.S. military leadership and threatens to affect future partnerships at precisely the time we need them most. While Israel can provide humanitarian assistance to the Kurds of northern Syria and also apply diplomatic pressure, said Cooperwasser, military intervention is out of the question. Asked how the rapidly escalating events in Syria might impact regional security, Cooperwasser said it's still too early to tell. The power of the various actors and the weight of the U.S. deterrence is being tested, he said, adding that it's still at an early stage. It's not yet clear where it's headed. Hence, in this context, we have to wait and see what the repercussions are. One thing is clear, said Cooperwasser, is that these events have no direct repercussions as far as U.S.-Israel relations are concerned. The depth of the U.S. commitment to Israel is very different from its commitment to the Syrian Kurds, he said. Regarding the ongoing threat posed by Iran and Syria, Cooper-Wasser said Israel has no choice but to defend itself by itself, and it will continue to do this. He added, however, that while Israel is acting decisively to prevent an Iranian base in Syria, what is important in this context is that the economic American pressure on Iran continues. So long as sanctions are maintained, he said, despite pinpoint Iranian achievements on the ground, the infrastructure of Iran is still eroding. They can't hold on for a long time without money. It all costs money in the end. Our next story, concern in Gulf Arab states after the U.S. pullout from Syria. From Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, contributed by the American Press, Associated Press. For decades considered a U.S. national security priority, the Persian Gulf remains home to tens of thousands of American troops spread across sprawling bases protecting crucial routes for global energy supplies. But while U.S.-Iran tensions in the Gulf appeared close to sparking a global conflagration this summer, attention now rapidly has shifted to Syria in a conflict that no less has impact here. Countries across the Persian Gulf wonder whether they should take away from U.S. President Donald Trump's withdrawal of American forces from Syria after apparently acquiescing to Turkey's invasion of Kurdish territory. Just as Turkey's expedition has seen a rapid flux in alliances in Syria's years-long war, it also has seen Gulf Arab nations make their own calculations about how far to trust Trump if tensions with Iran boil over. These nations all have their own views on Turkey's ambitions under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan as well. Meanwhile, the U.S. withdrawal comes after years of Tehran calling for America to end its military presence in a nation Iran views as a critical outpost to pressure Israel. Trump has boosted the U.S. military presence across the Persian Gulf since May, when he sent an aircraft carrier strike group, nuclear-capable B-52 bombers, and advanced jet fighters to the region over what the White House described as threats from Iran. In the time since, he sent U.S. troops and Patriot missiles into Saudi Arabia for the first time since the September 11, 2011 terror attacks, an assault launched by Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, in part over America's presence there. The tensions worry Kuwait and Oman, which have worked to ease tensions. Kuwait even went so far as to tell its public it had 8 months' worth of food in case of a national emergency. Qatar, still boycotted by Bahrain, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, has relied on Iranian airspace and shares a massive offshore natural gas field with Tehran that provides the nation its wealth. However, Saudi Arabia likely understands the transactional nature by which Trump framed his decision. That's been apparent since Trump waved posters showing its weapons purchases before a bemused Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in the Oval Office last year. We are sending troops and other things to the Middle East to help Saudi Arabia, Trump told journalists on the White House lawn on October 11th. But are you ready? Saudi Arabia, at my request, has agreed to pay us for everything we're doing. That's a first. Both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the Federation of Sheikdoms, home to Dubai, welcomed Trump's election and his policy of increasing pressure on Iran. But after Trump backed down from retaliating over Iran shooting down a U.S. military surveillance drone in June, the United Arab Emirates has made efforts to ease tensions with Tehran by sending officials there. It also began pulling its troops out of a years-long Saudi-led war in Yemen against rebels backed by Iran. Saudi Arabia's Prince Mohammed even recently told CBS that the kingdom is open to all initiatives for a political solution in Yemen. That's a long way from another CBS interview last year in which he compared Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei to Nazi leader Adolf Hitler. The pragmatism can be heard in how both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates look at Syria. Since the start of the country's war in 2011, it backed those trying to overthrow Assad. Lately, though, Emirates appear to have accepted the idea of Assad remaining in Syria. They reopened their embassy in Damascus in December and are encouraging Emirati business over officials to invest there to increase the United Arab Emirates soft power. The National, the Abu Dhabi-based government-linked newspaper, in an editorial Tuesday even went as far as to refer to Assad as the lesser of two evils for the Kurds. It criticized the U.S. for leaving the Kurds abandoned with little leverage. The world must not stand idle while Syria is invaded and its various ethnic factions endure yet more losses, the newspaper said. That the United Arab Emirates would move closer to accepting Assad suggests Saudi Arabia may not be far behind. And while they remain suspicious of Iran's influence, it's likely they view Turkey as the greater concern. For the UAE's government in Abu Dhabi, which long has targeted Islamists as a threat to their sheikhdom's hereditary rulers, Erdogan's embrace of Sunni Islamists remains deeply concerning. Saudi Arabia views Ankara with suspicion through the prism of history, as the Ottomans once governed the two holy mosques and claimed the mantle of Islam's protector, a role that Al Saud ruling family now holds. Erdogan previously has suggested that Turkey is the only country that can lead the Muslim world. Turkey also slowly leaked information about Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi's assassination and dismemberment inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul last year for its maximum impact. In a sign of hedging their bets, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates hosted Russian President Vladimir Putin in their capitals this week. Putin received the red carpet treatment in both nations, including escorts by troops on horseback and even a military jet flyover that sprayed smoke in the red, white, and blue of the Russian flag. Putin intervened in Syria to support Assad and maintain Moscow's military presence on the Mediterranean Sea. U.S. troops, however, maintain their presence across the Persian Gulf, but Gulf Arab leaders undoubtedly have to wonder if and when that could change. Our next story, Netanyahu tells the president he can't form a government. Now it's Gantz's turn to try. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday evening announced he had failed to muster a coalition after almost 4 weeks of effort, and therefore returned to the mandate to form a government to President Reuven Rivlin. Netanyahu's 28-day deadline for building a government was due to expire on Wednesday. Rivlin is now expected, probably on Tuesday morning, to charge Blue and White Party leader Benny Gantz with the task of trying to muster a coalition that can win a Knesset majority. Blue and White said it was determined to build the liberal unity government led by Benny Gantz that the people of Israel voted for. Gantz now has 28 days to try and do what Netanyahu could not. If he fails, any MK, which is a Knesset minister, will have 21 days to obtain the support of a Knesset majority to form a government. If no one succeeds, elections will be initiated automatically, a third round inside a year after April and September's inconclusive votes. At the end of May, after trying in vain for 6 weeks to build a coalition, Netanyahu called new elections rather than allow Gantz the chance to do so. Monday evening's move to return the mandate to Rivlin followed repeated pledges by Likud that Netanyahu would not again dissolve parliament without letting his rival attempt to muster a majority. In a video statement, Netanyahu, who turned 70 on Monday, said he had worked incessantly over the past 26 days to form a broad national unity government, which would include his Likud party's religious allies and the rival Blue and White Party, but had been thwarted by its leader, Benny Gantz. Since I received the mandate, I have worked incessantly, both in public and behind the scenes, to establish a broad national unity government. This is what the people want. This is also what Israel needs in the face of security challenges that are growing by the day, by the hour, Netanyahu said. I made every effort to bring Benny Gantz to the negotiating table, every effort to establish a broad national unity government, every effort to prevent another election, he said. Unfortunately, time after time, he declined. He simply refused. Yair Lapid, the number 2 in Blue and White, hit back minutes later. Bibi Netanyahu again failed, he said in a statement. The time for spin is over, the blue and white statement said it is now time for action. A statement from Rivlin's office said the president received Netanyahu's request to return the mandate. The statement said the Director General of the President's residence would inform faction heads that Rivlin intends to now task Gantz with forming a government. Netanyahu was tasked by Rivlin with trying to form a government based on the strength of his pact with right-wing and ultra-Orthodox parties to negotiate a bloc of 55 MKs, ministers, after September 17th inclusive election, with Likud getting 32 seats, Shas 9, United Torah Judaism 7, and Yamina 7. Gantz heads a bloc of 54 from the center, left, and Arab parties, blue and white 33, Labor Gesher 6, Democratic Camp 5, and 10 MKs from the mainly Arab joint list. But the 10 Arab ministers in that group would not join a Gantz-led coalition. 3 other ministers from the joint list did not back either candidate. Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu holds the balance of power between the Netanyahu and Gantz-led blocs with 8 seats, and has called for a secular unity government comprising Likud, blue and white, and his own party. But Netanyahu has refused to abandon his ultra-Orthodox partner Shas and United Torah Judaism, and Gantz has hitherto refused to partner with Likud so long as Netanyahu is facing possible indictment in 3 corruption cases. Rivlin has suggested a unity government in which power would be equally divided, and Netanyahu would each serve 2 years as prime minister. Rivlin implied but did not specify that Netanyahu would take an open-ended leave of absence if or when he is indicted in one or more of the probes in which he faces charges. Under the arrangement set out by Rivlin, Gantz, as interim prime minister in such a scenario, would enjoy all prime ministerial authority. But the 2 parties have been unable to agree, among other matters, on who would be prime minister first under such an agreement. Prosecution officials said last week they hope to reach a final decision on whether to indict the premier by the end of the year and possibly by next month. Our next story, nearing midnight, Thinking on Gog Magog, contributed by Terry James. Regions directly north of Jerusalem are being stirred to turmoil by the whirlwinds of prophetic destiny. Therefore, it's the responsibility of watchmen on the wall to closely examine all things powerfully affecting that area, so concentric to biblical prophecy yet to be fulfilled. The specific prophecy, of course, involves that given about the Gog-Magog battle in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. We've been watching the stage setting for some time. Russia, which we believe to be Rosh, Iran, the greatest part of which is almost certainly Persia, and Turkey, which we believe to be a reference to most of what was ancient Torgama, has been coalescing to Israel's north for quite some time. This alone can be seen as nothing short of astonishing. Now, with the whole region directly to Israel's north lighting up with what looks to be prophetic pyrotechnics, the spiritually attuned discerner's observational power should be fully turned on and in focus. We have some from the Christian media community making declarations of what developments mean. Pat Robertson said the following on a 700 Club show: "I am absolutely appalled that the United States is going to betray those democratic forces in northern Syria, that we possibly are going to allow the Turkish to come in against the Kurds." In typical word of knowledge power he claims to have, he offered further the President of the United States is in danger of losing the mandate of heaven if he permits this to happen. While I can't and don't wish to be able to claim such word of knowledge ability to pontificate, I'm concerned but not necessarily against the President's decision. I certainly don't believe his decision to withdraw America from the immediate region of hostilities will doom Mr. Trump to a loss in the 2020 presidential elections. It might just be that the move is by the very hand of God. We can know for sure that America withdrawing in such a manner has in no way slipped up on the Creator of all things. This has not escaped his omniscience. Turkey invading northern Syria to get at rebels of the region is a serious matter. The Kurdish people are in danger. Many among them are Christians, and that is one reason for many concerns among we who pray for our brothers and sisters there. But so should we pray for all who face death and destruction in this or any military incursion. So I, like you, don't view all this lightly. I do, however, consider these matters from a particularly focused perspective. Things taking place in that biblically important part of the world at this late hour in this quickly fleeting age of grace must be critically important. In view of all other converging signs we are discerning, any such apparent stage setting should light up the eschatological radar screens. It is proper to consider, I think, whether this president's decision to remove American involvement from that specific area is God ordained. I don't mean that Mr. Trump might be aware of it possibly being a directive from on high. That in no way is part of this bit of prophetic pondering on this pact. We know that America is not mentioned by name in Ezekiel's Gog prophecy, just as the nation isn't mentioned in any prophecy by name. Here is what we do know God's prophetic word says about the nations observing that attack from the sidelines. The attackers we believe to be led by Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to carry away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? Ezekiel 38:13. My scenario pondering is wrapped up in the following. I claim no word of knowledge. With America removed from that region of interminable conflict, the other nations that presently comprise NATO and all other countries of combatant loaning sorts might not be willing to intervene against the assault. Most consider Israel as the problem in the world. Think about the UN being almost totally against Israel on every issue. If America isn't there at the time of the Gog-Magog assault, these nations will almost certainly, without question, not seek to oppose the coalition led by a powerful Russia. The removal of America at this time from this theater of future war is most interesting to contemplate. God tells in this prophecy that He alone will save His chosen nation. There will be no doubt about who this rescues. America's military might not do so, that's for sure, but God will, and that we can be sure of. And that, my friends, is this week's edition of Revealing Prophecy. This program, along with Revealing the Bible, are only available after they air through the Biblical Truth Library. I want to encourage you to visit ignitinganation.com and sign up for our weekly newsletter and check out the Biblical Truth Library with its over 940 hours of biblical teaching. You can follow us online through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can catch up on over 1,400 interviews and never miss any of our great guests. Your comments and questions are always welcome, and we may include your answer in the next edition of the newsletter. Don't forget our regular live broadcasts on Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Time. You can see them on Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and on our website, ignitinganation.com, as well as other outlets throughout the world. Until we see you right back here tomorrow for the next edition of Revealing the Truth, we thank you for watching and bid you Shalom.